Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. I am a big opponent of unions. Do not like them. My 25 years in prison has shown me up close and personal the effects of unions. So when I got to read an article recently by today's guest, I was very excited. I've had him on before. I've known him for a while, and I think he's going to enlighten us quite a bit. He has a bachelor's degree from Grove City College in economics, and he is currently pursuing his PhD at West Virginia University. And he's the author of numerous articles. Benjamin Seevers, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, I should say.
Yeah. Thank you for having me back, Michael. It's a pleasure.
To start with, let's get a good definition of labor. What is labor?
Well, now that's the tricky one. That's the because nobody really knows.
That's why I asked it first.
Yeah. Well, when economists use labor, we're just talking about physical effort. The effort goes into production processes. So you got land, labor, and capital. Capital is produced factors of production, and the original factors of production are land and labor. Land, physical resources, and labor. I guess you could call it human resources. Human.
Hold on one second, Benjamin. I just want to clarify. You said capital is produced factors of production. Do you mean capital goods are the
capital
produced
goods?
factors?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's another thing.
It is, but I just want to. I want to be precise.
Yeah.
I figured that's what you
goods.
meant.
Yeah. But that's how like I guess normal people use labor. I don't know. When I talk about labor, I'm usually talking about just me laboring in a field or laboring at a bank or laboring who knows where at a different at one job or another. But when labor union advocates speak about labor, it's really ambiguous because usually it just means the groups I want to favor to give political favors to. So that's not a really good definition at all because that's just arbitrary. It's relative to the individual. Yeah.
Well, that leads us to the subject of your article was the idea of supporting all labor, and you take issue with that notion. Explain why, because I think it's a very enlightening take you presented.
Yeah. So the articles mainly, and I get into like some other slogans later, but the article mainly attacks the slogan "Support all labor." And if you're in if you have progressive friends, or if you've ever been to like a labor event, some type of Labor Day celebration, like we just had a few weeks ago, you'll usually see slogans like "Support all labor" or "Don't be a scab." Now, I take issue with "Support all labor" because usually, and history has kind of affirmed this, it's being applied to supporting labor that we just shouldn't support, that is antithetical to a free society. That's one critique I made. And the good examples of that are police. And I know you're an objectivist, and I don't know if you think the government should be eradicated entirely. And but police to a great extent today are horrible for liberty. They're enforcing laws such as drug laws, or they're enforcing immigration laws, or they're enforcing gun control laws, or any law that really is not consistent with private property or individual freedom. They enforce. And now we're going to allow them to unionize. We're going to give them special privileges. We're going to protect them, like qualified immunity. Like that's a product of supporting police labor. And the result is that police officers have been able to go unaccountable in a lot of their actions. So yeah, that should just be a red flag to progressives who are also against a lot of stuff like qualified immunity. And they may not be exactly in favor of police unions, but that just reveals some of the inconsistency of their position.
Right. It does.
Yeah.
Benjamin, I've argued this point for a long time. So on the right, and by the right, I mean your standard conservative Republicans. I don't mean every single conservative and every single Republican, but for the sake of discussion, you have to generalize. And I would say most support the police.
Yeah.
And they support police unions, which is odd because they frequently argue about the harm that unions do.
Yeah.
But they don't think that same principle applies when the union is for the police. Similarly with qualified immunity, and I've made this argument to quite a few conservatives, that you claim that you're against judicial activism, but qualified immunity was created out of whole cloth by the court. Wasn't legislated,
Mhm.
but you defend that to the hilt, which goes to kind of, I think, your point about labor is the people that say support labor, like you say, they mean support the labor that I like. So on the
Yeah.
left, when they say support labor, they mean teacher unions, they mean all public sector unions, they
Yep.
auto workers unions, that type of thing. So they don't really mean all labor. So
Yeah,
that
they don't.
basically your critique of it, right? Is that
Yeah.
it's just not true.
Yeah, it isn't. And to your point on the right, um, flashback to 2012, you got the Tea Party movement. I referenced this in the article. I talked about
Jim
Jim
DeMint.
DeMint, and I'm a big fan. I was a big fan of him. I haven't really followed him since, but when I back a long time ago, I read some of his books. But he was a big opponent of public unions, and I think that they wanted to unionize. They wanted to unionize the TSA, I believe, and he was a strict opponent of that. And I think there were probably some on the right who agreed with unionization. Of course, the progressives did as well. And that's more of an ambiguous area because the left aren't exactly opposing
Yeah.
TSA. But then again, yeah, TSA opposes our liberties, opposes our freedoms, and they're we should not support them. But I think some of the conservatives are on the right side on that debate. I think it's become more ambiguous recently. Of course, police, it's still a huge blind spot for conservatives.
Yes.
But I think by and large, they're against this conception of public unions more than they used to. But there's also like this undercurrent that's trying to be more pro-labor in the Republican Party. People like Patrick Deneen, who's kind of more of he's a conservative Catholic. He's a Catholic and a conservative philosopher, a political philosopher. He's trying to appeal more to like
The author who critiques liberalism, right, and gets it
yeah,
wrong.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Classical liberalism. I mean,
yeah,
not. Yeah, and he gets it wrong. I read a book of his, and he butchered the idea. He
yeah,
mistook, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds with that guy, but
yeah. We
he
don't have to. Yeah,
mistook continental liberalism with classical liberalism.
yeah,
But like you said, I'm not anti-police. I've had plenty,
yeah,
believe me, I've had more interactions with police than I need to.
yeah.
And I've known a lot of good cops. A lot of good cops when I was
Mhm.
growing up tried to help me, tried to steer me in the right direction. I've known a lot of
Yeah,
bad cops. And I do believe that police are necessary for a free
yeah,
society. However, when you create a union that protects bad cops, you pervert incentives because
yeah.
now good cops
Exactly.
know if they report the bad cops, nothing's going to happen to them. So
Yeah,
they end up not reporting them, and it allows that sort of infection to grow. And then that's the type of stuff that we end up hearing about. Like, yeah, I think you referenced George Floyd. Maybe it was, I
yeah.
just thought
George
it, but
Floyd, Breonna Taylor.
sure, sure.
Yeah,
But I'm by no means opposed to all police. Like I'm not
yeah,
opposed to teachers. But when you
yeah,
put a union in place that protects the bad, that corrupts the whole system.
yeah.
And I've gotten way ahead because my next question to you actually was going to be what is the two questions really is what are some of the problems that unions cause? That's the first part. I'll get to the second part after that.
Yeah. So I guess the main I would say the main problem with unions today are that they're protected. They're protected by government, and it's imposing a higher cost on entrepreneurs and capitalists, and ultimately consumers through increasing amount of uh, compensation through basically coercion and compulsion. Like if I there's some strikes that are protected. I think that's it depends on the situation. I think that the current screenwriters strike is protected. I'm not sure. That's a more of a recent thing. But whenever your laborers go on strike and you can't fire them, like what that's just a blatant violation
Sure.
of your freedom to just to terminate contracts. And so and then there's like also physical, like non-legal coercion. That used to be bigger. Like I remember there's a story one of my econ professors told me about how he had a student one time whose uncle was killed by a by a union organizers. Like they drove by and like shot him and killed him.
Yeah.
I don't think they intended to kill him. I think they meant to like shoot him and like incapacitate him or something just to intimidate him, but they ended up killing him, which is still bad. But yeah, yeah,
Yeah, if I'm dead, I mean, I'm sure the
yeah.
people that care
Oh,
about me.
I intended to incapacitate.
I'm not gonna
No, but
care
yeah,
about that.
it's bad either way. Yeah, but yeah, there's physical, there's violence, and I'd say it's less like that today. But there's still an element of that. I remember there's still steel worker union strikes around me, aluminum, Alcoa. They would run up and go on the trucks and like hold up their signs and block entry
Sure.
into facilities and so on. And they occupy public space. They're using public goods to do this too. Like they're on sidewalks or on the road. It's a mess. And they're basically using artificial rights the government gives them to coerce employers to give them a bigger cut of the pie.
Right.
And inevitably, the employers will have to make cuts elsewhere to compensate for these compensation that they have to give by law.
Yeah.
So, or they're compelled to give by law. So, but I don't have a. I think it gets a little tricky when you suspend government privileges because there have been historically cases where unions actually provide services, beneficial services. So Mir Cohn, in his book, he's an economist. In his book, Financial Markets and Institutions, I believe that's what it's called. He talks about how he references how unions used to provide some type of unemployment insurance before, and I can see that's a beneficial function. But after government started introducing that stuff, they
Yeah,
started
well, that's the problem is for me. There's two problems for this. One is when it comes to public sector unions, and my next question has to do with differentiating the two. But public workers are supposed to represent the people that vote government in, that vote for the politicians. The government is supposed to be our representative. And the idea that they then unionize to gain special privileges seems absurd to me. But the bigger thing, and you mentioned this, is that by law, unless it's changed, then I'm unaware, and I don't think it has, is that companies have to negotiate with unions.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just legally say, you know what, I don't care, go, goodbye, you're fired, and we're going to hire whatever you want to call them, scabs, replacements is what I would call them.
Yeah.
So, and whenever you do that, you tilt the scale. And it corrupts the entire process, and I think that's what you're getting at. But what is the difference between private and public sector unions? Is it just a matter of the public sector are government employees and private sector unions work in the private sector?
Yeah, just putting it like that kind of makes it seem like it's just a classification issue. Like suspending ethics, I'm not sure if there's really any difference. Like, okay, what's a crime? What's a criminal union? Like, I don't know. But basically, like public unions, I would say that the defining feature is that they're funded by taxation. They're basically funded by theft from the people. But while private unions, at least the funds they're getting are from voluntarily, ideally from the entrepreneur, from the capitalist, from the final consumer. So the private public distinction is all about okay, one is predicated on force and violence, and the other one's not. So but today it's like, okay,
well, they all are now,
unions,
right?
Yeah, are all
even
unions
the private
public?
sector is.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a hard line to draw because everything has the shadow of the government over it. So, but some have a larger shadow.
Sounds like a good title to a book, The Shadow of Government.
Yeah,
I like that. Is it already?
I'm sure someone's already done it. I don't know.
If not, you
Someone
should call the copyright office and get that taken care of. But there's also the problem with politicians now use unions to get votes. By granting unions special privileges, now they garner the vote of union members, and that allows them to stay in power, which allows them to grant more favors, which gets them more votes, and the thing just keeps going and going and going. And I mentioned earlier, in prison, I mean, there's nothing you can really do. I mean, I've seen plenty of correctional officers sleeping on the job. fraternizing with inmates. It's against the rules for them to bring in cell phones. They're sitting on their cell phones, playing all day. And what can you do? I mean, they come in with big backpacks. Like, what the hell are you bringing into to the prison that you need a backpack? You know what I mean? But they get away with it because they're protected by the union.
Yeah.
Now, go ahead, Benjamin.
Yeah, well, obviously that drives up costs, but I guess a ironic thing about this is maybe sometimes you don't want your public employees to be working hard.
Well, it depends what you mean by
yeah.
hard. If you mean hard and smart, I would say then yes. But if just hard, I mean, they could work hard giving me a beating. I don't want them working
exactly.
hard.
I don't want
them
that.
Working hard at that.
Yeah.
No, me neither. So a lot of people would argue that if you don't have unions, basically employers run roughshod over their employees. Working conditions are bad, wages are kept low. How do you answer that? In a free market, what governs that type of thing? What governs wages? What governs working conditions?
Yeah. There's a really good book by Benjamin Powell. I think it's called Out of Poverty. He talks about sweatshop workers, and the conversations he has in that book apply well to this case. He talks about compensating differentials. Whenever you face a harder work environment, a worse work environment, terrible working conditions, your wage, you're compensated in a higher wage or some other higher compensation. So, but when these workers he was surveying in the third world country were questioned, like, would you take a better working condition for in exchange for a lower salary? They said no, and he posed like a bunch of different questions to them. I can't really remember all of them. It'd be hard to recall, but basically it just was that a lot of these people, like, who are in these voluntary contracts with their employers, they prefer to face a harsher working condition in exchange for a higher wage. And you see this with comparing wages between fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico versus fishermen in the Bering Sea. The ones in the Bering Sea get a higher wage, but their working conditions suck. So, but should the government get involved and maybe give some guarantee that they can unionize or pass some regulations to improve their conditions? No, because they prefer that and they choose that. They self-select and they're getting a higher wage because of it. So I imagine, if you want to be an abusive worker, for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe you just like that. Maybe that's how you profit from it. You probably have to pay a higher wage in order to get away with that, in order to have employers constantly at your disposal to get the job done. And horribly abusive employers will be run out of business because no one will want to work with them. But it's always about a trade-off. I mean, what's abuse? Like, is it not getting a smoke break? Is it having to work 9 hours instead of 8? Like, what is abuse? I mean, it's so vaguely defined, and everything that is like labor union activists are anything that falls short of sitting at home doing it nothing, getting paid, is going to be unsatisfactory to them. Like, they want the payment. Everyone wants payment without work. Everyone wants payment without bearing a cost or going through some physical labor or some effort or bearing some type of negative side effect. But it's all about the trade-offs. You want a higher return that compensates you for whatever negative effect that going through that work actually gives you, like like how it affects your circumstances. So that's how I'd respond to it. I mean, the efficient level of abuse is going to be determined by the market, and abuse is arbitrarily, vaguely defined. So if people are willing to work in that environment, they should be free to. That's how I'd answer it.
It's
Those
governed
who
by
are abusive are going to get driven out of the market.
Yeah, it's governed by the voluntary choices of individuals. Von Mises argued that wages are ultimately determined by the marginal productivity of labor. That's going to be way too much to get into. So I'm just going to put it this way, is that it's ultimately wages are governed by supply and demand. What is the demand for the worker? How many people are willing to supply at a given wage? And then you end up with a wage. So in a free market, if there was no government tilting the scales, I'd be fine with unions because that would be part of the supply and demand. the workers would get together and say, we're not going to work. We're not going to supply you with our labor unless you're going to raise the cost. And then if the entrepreneur, the business owner could find somebody to replace him, he does. If he can't, then that's going to govern wages, and it's all voluntary and it's fine. But when the government tilts the scale, one, it's a rights violation because you're interfering in contracts. And then there's an abundance of problems that come about. And that actually is going to lead me to my next question that has to do with minimum wages. In your studies of economics, what are the effects of minimum wage? Well, first of all, what are the intended or the stated intended effects of minimum wages when these laws are passed, and what actually happens?
Yeah. So the intent, I'll start with the intended effects. The intended effects are to increase wages without unemploying people. That seems to be the intended effect, because every progressive who defends the minimum wage against evidence to the contrary, basically cite evidence or some data point that says that wages increased and unemployment either didn't decrease or increased. So their whole thing is that they want to increase people's wages without unemploying people. Now, in the studying economics, you know that minimum wages are either effective or ineffective. So if everyone's being paid above $15 an hour and you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, nothing's going to happen. But if it's effective, meaning that the minimum wage is above the market wage, you know, the whatever people are getting paid, there will be an unemployment effect. So, or either nothing will change or there will be unemployment. So, like say, like the demand for labor is inelastic, which never happens. There will be no unemployment. But given that hardly anything's totally inelastic, there's going to be some unemployment on the margins. So when the minimum wage goes above the market wage, there's going to be some unemployment effect. Now, what that is exactly, it's hard to tell, because it could either take the form of cutting compensation in other areas, or it could take the form of people getting laid off, or your labor hours could be decreased. Because like what are employers really buying? They're not buying labor. They're not buying a unit of labor. They're buying an hour of labor, 2 hours of labor. They're not buying a worker. So they may unemploy people by cutting their hours. But at the end of the day, they're still on the payroll. So there's not unemployment in the sense that government uses it in their statistics, but there's still unemployment in the real sense that people are working less hours. So there's a lot of different ways it could manifest. But at the end of the day, it's either going to come out in less compensation elsewhere, or labor or amount of hours, total hours being cut in some way. So that's basically how it is affected. And I'll touch on David Card, because Card and Kroger, they have the study on comparing New Jersey and Pennsylvania.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and I forget the guy's name. But
I pronounce it Alan Kruger, but I don't. But you said Krager, but it's the same guy, right?
Kroger, I don't care.
Yeah, we go with whatever.
There's this guy. I'll try to find him. Neumann. He wrote this paper criticizing their methods, and he looked at tax data, and he found that basically that unemployment did increase. So he was looking at official data. What Card and Kroger, whatever you guys say their name, what they found, how they looked into it was they called fast food restaurants and were like, "Oh, did you unemploy anybody?" And the manager would just be like, I don't think so. Like, how would they, like, you're just calling them and some random person's answering the phone and looking around the restaurant and trying to answer your question. That's how they did the research. So that's their minimum wage paper that all the progressives love to cite that they didn't read. And what's really funny is Card and Kroger didn't win the Nobel Prize for their minimum wage studies. They won the Nobel Prize for their groundbreaking methods of econometrics. They won for research methods. They didn't win for their conclusions. So people who say, "Oh, look at this guy, he won the Nobel Prize and he says minimum wages don't cause unemployment," they just don't know what they're talking about. And when presented with like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about because you haven't read it," they they just shut off. They don't care because they don't really care about the evidence. They don't care about truth. They just want their, as I said before, they want their groups to win and your groups to lose, and they're not even trying. They're not even trying to be honest.
Isn't it true too that in situations like that, that an economy is very dynamic? There's all types of
Yeah.
forces that are operating at once. So, for instance, if the minimum wage was raised, let's say at the federal level,
Yeah.
or even the local level, wherever, but there was a concomitant increase in the money supply,
Yeah. Yeah.
that could cause a rise in prices, including the price of labor,
Exactly.
then the labor cost would have went up anyways, wages would have went up anyways, so you wouldn't end up with unemployment, but you would end up with higher prices, so the increased wages do nothing anyways. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
different factors that can be affecting the
Yeah.
market.
Infinite amount, like millions.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, what they did, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while, but they looked at one state that raised the minimum wage and the other state didn't, and they compared them. But all types of different things can be going on
Exactly.
in the state, that even if their methodology, which from what I understand is very, very flawed, but I don't remember that at all. But even if the methodology was sound in terms of measuring unemployment, you can't account for every factor. It's not a lab test where everything can be held equal. The law of supply and demand is the law of supply and demand. That's why they call it a law. I mean, I don't know how else to state it. So, I mean, the law is operative. To deny that all things remaining equal, an increase in the price of labor would not lead to unemployment is to deny the very fundamentals of economics, right?
Yeah, and they found that they were only looking at fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania along the border, and who knows what could have been happening. I haven't looked into this myself, but I think it'd be worthwhile to see how was the fast food industry doing? Were they experiencing a huge boom in the 90s? I don't know, and that would probably correlate with higher wages. So if their wages, if the market wage is increasing while the minimum wage is also increasing, you probably wouldn't expect to see as much, at least as much unemployment. And I remember this just now, that in their study they do find that underaged and young workers were unemployed relative to older workers. That's something they did find. So, but that's something we would expect to see. We would expect if you're increasing the minimum wage, the employers are going to discriminate more and choose people who are much more experienced rather than young people who have no experience, don't know what they're doing, and need trained and so on. So they do find that, and I guess that could be I don't know, the truth peeking out of their study. But yeah, you're right. You're completely right. I mean, there's a million different things that could be going on, and it's best to keep the law of supply and demand in mind when doing these studies. Nothing's going to refute that.
Unless you're going to say that the price of labor is completely inelastic.
But that, even then, it's not good. That's never going to happen.
No,
and
of course
then
not.
Then you have to think about how that's going to affect other industries too. Are people going to quit their jobs in Pennsylvania along the border and move and get a job in New Jersey? Or there's going to be some type of and I don't think that would appear in unemployment because they're quitting. So there's a million things that could happen. There's unintended consequences of these things too. So even if somehow you could prove that minimum wages could increase while keeping the quantity of labor constant, there's going to be some other side effect that nobody can predict that. Even those who can predict it are going to be ignored. So
for the record, I would say even if you could raise the wages, you shouldn't, because it's an initiation of force on the part of government in interfering with contracts. That to me ends the discussion right there. But I do think it's fruitful to discuss what the actual effects are in the history of it. You mentioned the word discrimination. There's a big racist element in this, where they unions wanted to increase wages to price minorities, specifically blacks, out of the labor market to keep the jobs for themselves. that's something that the left doesn't ever seem to want to talk about, at
Yeah.
least nowhere I've seen, but it's nonetheless historically accurate.
Yeah, it's never they never acknowledge that. And if you bring it up to them, they don't know how to react to it. And like but they just some of these people like they're advocates, they're activists who have been in this their entire lives. It's just it's like trying to talk to a brick wall. Like you can't get through to them. It's some people just are not and at the end of the day, they benefit from being wrong. So why would they stop? Why would they quit? Yeah. And
So right now we happen to be in the middle of the two labor disputes, with the
oh
Screen
yeah.
Actors Guild and the United Auto Workers. But I'm just curious of what your sense is. Like, what is the future of unions in this country, both private and public? Are we going to
Yeah.
see a big increase, a decrease? Are they going to stay the same? What's your sense of what's going to happen?
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring this up earlier because it connected to something you were saying previously, but I didn't. There's a Janus decision. It's a Supreme Court case, Janus, and I think it weakened public unions. I haven't read it real well, but that's a blow to them. Like you don't have to join a public union. I know in Pennsylvania there were some cases that led to people having more rights to uh, not be a part of unions. Like there are some cases where unions were putting money in places where the person didn't want money to be fallen into. Like some people were pro-life, opposed teachers unions because teachers unions were giving money to Planned Parenthood and Democrat candidates that supported abortion, stuff like that. So yeah, they're being weakened on that front, in the legal front. And there's also laws such as right to work laws, and they're gaining steam. And union membership is down, but really it varies across different unions. Because I mean, Screen Actors, I don't know about Screen Actors Guild and Film Actors Guild. That's from Team America. Have you ever seen that movie? Okay, there's a joke they run in that called the Film Actors Guild. You can see that what that would be.
Okay.
But
Okay.
there's the Screen Actors Guild, and I don't know about their union membership, but I think that mainly like a lot of like I guess like the working man, the real what you think of the working man, they're not being involved in unions as much. Like I don't care about the Screen Actors Guild. They like screw them. Like I they, I don't like their movies. They can they can just fail. Like why should I care about their labor? Why should I support their labor? But yeah, as I've said, on the legal front, they're losing. On the membership front, they're losing. So in the long run, I don't know where it'll go because humans aren't bugs. We don't
No,
our behavior isn't
there's
set in stone.
that that
So
that pesky free will
yeah,
it always gets in the way. I
yeah,
remember reading in Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative, and
mm,
he wanted to subject unions to antitrust laws. And to
mm,
me, that is the exact wrong approach,
yeah,
because I think antitrust laws are wrong to begin
yeah,
with. And I see a lot of that happen where they one wrong and then they want to pile on, and it just gets worse and worse. But I'm curious, do you think that it would be the right approach or an effective approach to subject unions to antitrust laws?
yeah. I don't think that's right. If the only right approach here is just to stop giving them political favors, stop giving them grants of privilege. Like that's the only right approach, and that's where right to work I think fails to some extent. Like right to work laws basically say that your boss cannot require you to join a union. Well, what if
Yeah,
your boss wants you to join a union?
yeah.
And like I think that'd be unlikely in a free market. But as we said before, unions can provide a service. They
It should
can,
all be
uh,
free. Just
yeah,
let let
yeah,
let it be. Let people make their own
yeah,
damn decisions in this world,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Don't subject them to antitrust. Don't pass right to work laws. Just stop giving them government privileges. Is that really that simple? Like, uh, one service, and you alluded to it. They may just help the employer find the market wage, find what the market wage is.
Sure.
Save on information costs. Like that's one beneficial function that they might serve in a free market. And we shouldn't neglect that. We shouldn't throw that away just because we're trying to be like, I don't know, super based and anti-union. I don't know, like that we just
We
stop
should be
supporting government
pro
privileges.
freedom, is what we
Yeah.
should be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree. All right, Benjamin, that was a very fruitful discussion. I really enjoyed it. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So I have a Mises writers profile. So go to Mises.org slash like here I have it pulled up. I forget what the link is always. Okay, Mises.org slash profile slash Benjamin dash Seevers. That's my Mises profile. And I'm on Twitter too, unfortunately, or X apparently. I keep forgetting about that. Uh, Twitter slash at
It's so
official
much.
Seevers,
I
whatever.
feel ridiculous calling it X. I gotta be
Yeah,
honest. I just
yeah.
feel
I know. I like the spirit behind it.
stupid.
But yeah, I don't like it. And I ultimately don't like it.
All right. Benjamin, thank you very much. We will definitely be looking to have you on again. A young guy with some good insights. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. It's Michael Liebowitz. Hey, let me know what you think. Till next time.